Good morning, everyone. Thank you for being here. This is the Hamilton College Arboretum Saturday Speaker Series. I see a lot of familiar faces, so I'm sure you all know about it, but in case you didn't, welcome. I'm going to introduce our speaker and then we'll just get started. Natalie Nannas is a rising star in the genetics research firmament, unraveling life's intricate mysteries through cell division and segregation of their genetic material. With a keen scientific mind, honed with a bachelor's degree at Grinnell College and a PhD from a little university called Harvard, Natalie now brings her expertise to Hamilton, where she is an associate professor of biology and teaches a captivating array of courses that delve into the realms of genetic engineering, bioethics, and molecular genetics. Natalie's research focuses on the spindle machinery that ensures chromosomes are properly attached and separated during specialized cell division of meiosis. There won't be a test after this, I promise. Her work sheds light on the critical process that gives rise to egg and sperm cells for a new understanding of the genetic basis of miscarriages, infertility, and inherited disorders. Her scientific insights have been widely published in top-tier journals, and she has been awarded prestigious grants from the National Science Foundation to support her groundbreaking investigations. Beyond her research accolades, Natalie is also a dedicated educator. She guides students through the profound implications of genetic technologies and the ethical considerations they raise. In the classroom, she brings her infectious enthusiasm for the subject matter, fostering a deeper appreciation for the power and complexity of the human genome. When she's not immersed in scientific inquiry or inspiring the next generation of genetic scholars, Natalie enjoys spending time with her husband, John, who also works at Hamilton, and their young child, a perfect blend of family and academic life. Please welcome Natalie Nannas.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Krista, so much for the introduction. I tend to be a bit of a wanderer while I lecture, while I talk. So I'm pretty used to projecting in this space, but if anyone can't hear me, please just flag me down at any point. So I'm excited to talk to you guys today about GMOs, so genetically modified organisms. And we're going to talk about history of GMOs, some of the myths that surround them, as well as the science that actually produces them and what they really are. So I obviously come at it from a very scientific perspective. I work on genetics. I'm really interested in how we make genetically modified organisms. So when I say the term GMO, genetically modified organisms, the process of making them is something that we call genetic engineering. But when I say that term, GMO, what comes to your guys' mind? Seeds. Any other thoughts or feelings or ideas?
My wife not wanting to have like that.
Yeah, so the feelings of negativity of like, I don't want to have that in the house. I don't want to eat it. Yeah, anything else?
Think of cross-pollination risks in agricultural areas, organic versus inorganic disputes.
Yeah, organic, not organic, the spreading perhaps of these genetic things around in the ecosystem. Anything else?
Monsters.
Monsters. Glad you said that. Okay, so along with the not wanting to have it in the house idea, right? I think when people hear the term GMO, there's usually a lot of negativity surrounding it, a lot of fear, or what is that? Is it toxic? I work in both plants and animals, and I think a lot about genetic modification and what it can mean for people as well. So GMO, a lot of times we think about it just in the realm of plants, and that's what I'll mostly focus on today. But just to call out that GMO is anything that's genetically changed, genetically modified. So there is concern around designer babies. Is it safe? Again, usually people think about it in terms of food. Is it toxic? If you search the internet for GMO, you'll find all kinds of crazy pictures of things that aren't real. But there is that fear out there. And I just call out too, again, genetic modification can be animals as well. So these are actual genetically modified organisms, animals. If you've ever gone to PetSmart and seen these little glowing fish, these are genetically modified zebrafish that have green glowing fluorescence in them. And I'll tell you a little bit more about it. And these are some mice that also have that green glowing fluorescence placed into them. But we're going to focus today mostly on GMOs in the plant world. And so nobody said corn, darn it. Okay, I work on corn primarily, so happy to talk about corn as much as you want. But so when I hear GMO, I often think about GMO corn, the agriculture industry. And I'm going to tell you several different GMO examples today. One of which being corn, of course, and then this other one called golden rice, and another one related to fast-growing trees. Actually, I have even more than that. But before we get into it, I just want to give you a little bit of language around what we're going to be talking about today. So everything is based in DNA and genetics. And what does that really mean? So inside of all of our cells, plants, animals, bacteria, you name it, inside of any kind of cell, there's information in there that tells the cell how to be what it is, or how to tell the organism what it is. That material resides within these structures called chromosomes. Chromosomes, if you unravel them, are just made up of this long string molecule called DNA that you may have heard about in popular media. It is that basis of genetics. So if you unravel a chromosome, the structure is DNA, and somewhere along that length of DNA are these discrete little units, little pieces of DNA that we call a gene. And so a gene is simply a unit of information that will code for one particular protein. What's a protein? Proteins are just these molecules that help make up all the traits that we see. It's what makes a tomato red, or it's what makes leaves green. They're coding for this unit of information, makes a protein, that results in the traits that we see. So we're going to be talking about how do you change its DNA? How do you change that gene? Can you take it from one organism and put it into another organism to get new and different traits? So that's exactly what genetic engineering is, the process of making a GMO. So genetic engineering, it's a little up in the air about what it really is. Even the USDA and the FDA has trouble defining it. But usually it's this idea that you are directly manipulating the DNA of an organism. What does directly manipulating mean? Well, again, that's a little bit up for debate, but usually direct manipulation of DNA means that you're changing or editing the DNA inside of an organism. And it might mean introducing a new gene or a new trait in. So this example that I have here, I told you, or I showed you those pictures of those green glowing fish or those green glowing mice. What those are is they found a gene called GFP inside of jellyfish down deep in the ocean. These jellyfish glow green. So scientists were able to find the exact gene that causes that trait, cut it out of the jellyfish, put it into zebrafish, and now you've got glowfish, and you can go buy them at PetSmart. They're actually the only commercially available GMO animal. So glowfish, but for our plant examples, there are many, many examples of GMO plants. So we're going to talk through many of them today. But one of them is, what about rice? You take regular rice, then you think about carrots. All right, carrots have a variety of different nutritional properties in them. One of the things they have in them is a gene that codes for beta carotene. Really good for eye health, really good for nutrition. Can we take the gene for beta carotene out of carrots, put it into rice, and now we have sort of supercharged rice. Rice with additional nutritional value because it's now producing beta carotene and it looks golden, has that orange color because of beta carotene. So this would be an example of a GMO plant where we took genes from one organism, one species, put it into another species, and now we have this GM, genetically modified rice. Well, here's another one. Here's where it kind of starts to get a bit murky. Do we call this a GMO? What if we had rice again? Great, rice. But there's this variety of rice that I'm going to tell you about that can survive floods. So this is all within the species of rice. But these are two different cultivars, two different types. One is a commercially produced line that's really high yielding, a rice that we like to eat as humans. And then this wild variety that can survive a flood. Can you take the gene for this ability to survive a flood? It can grow really, really, really tall, reach above the surface of the floodwaters, and then the plant survives a flood season. Take that flood resistance gene, put it into this agricultural line of rice. And now we have rice that both is high yielding and can survive floods. So is that a genetic? Oh, it's called snorkel rice. I'll show you some more pictures of it in a bit. It grows incredibly tall. So is that a GMO? Because it's something that we could achieve without directly going in and cutting genes. We could just breed these two different rice together. I don't know. USDA and FDA are really struggling with whether this should be called a GMO or not. So before we start getting into some of those more examples of GMOs where we have directly changed DNA through various techniques, I want to talk to you about what I sort of see as the first genetic modification. So if genetic modification, genetic engineering is manipulating genes, manipulating DNA to get some desired trait, then technically domestication, picking this organism and that organism and breeding them together for desired traits, is a form of genetic modification. I'm picking the genetics, I'm controlling what gets inherited. So artificial selection, this process of I'm going to take this organism and this organism because they have traits I like, breed them together and then continue that process, was actually first done in animals. Dogs are sort of the first documented case of this domestication, this artificial selective breeding, where we're picking the genetics of the organism. So there's evidence that dogs started being domesticated about 20,000 years ago. From the original gray wolf, we've now gotten all of these different types of dogs. From that dog that had a white coat, we kind of like that. The dog that was really friendly, and we bred together those animals to get to all of this different diversity of dogs. So that apparently caught on. People were like, all right, we can control this genetic process. We can control the traits that we're seeing. And so we have evidence that about 10,000 years ago, that cattle, goats, and sheep also started having this process of domestication. People started controlling and breeding certain organisms together. So I would posit to you, is that a genetic modification, right? It's a manipulation of the genetics. You picked which genetics get passed on. You picked what breeds with what, you get offspring, and then you keep doing that process. So we were directly involved. We were picking and electing what the genetics would be in future generations. So just a little aside, we'll get back to plants, I promise, but this is just so fascinating. So when geneticists were trying to determine, is it really that simple? Is it really so simple that people could have picked the animals, bred them together, and you got that dramatic change? Well, there was essentially a recreation of dog domestication, kind of by accident. So there are these silver foxes that are native to northern Russia, and they were very sought after for their furs. They had these beautiful silver black furs, and so there was a lot of trapping going on trying to catch these foxes for their furs. So they decided actually it would be much easier if we could just farm foxes. So they started in the 1950s these fox farms where they would have lots and lots of foxes and could breed them together, and then an easy source of furs. And so actually there was a scientist and a geneticist just undercover at the farm, kind of helping manage that breeding process and watching the inheritance of traits. And so what they found was that it was actually really hard to work with the foxes. They were trying to keep them all in these pens, but they kept fighting with each other. They'd bite the handlers. They wouldn't eat. They were very difficult to work with. So the geneticist and the individuals working with the foxes were like, you know what? Let's just take the foxes that are nice and tame and don't bite us and they're easier to work with. Let's just breed those foxes, and then we'll have nice tame foxes. It'll make this process a lot easier. Well, what they found was after just a couple of generations of picking the tamest foxes, to breed and have more litters, here's what the foxes started looking like. They lost their coat that they were trying to maintain. What they saw is that the foxes started having floppy ears. They started having all of these white and gray mottled colors we often see in dogs. They also started barking. They would make little barking sounds, and they like to play. They'd throw a ball and they would go chase it and they would bring it back. They were very reward motivated. And that was only in a couple of generations. So it was accidental, but they actually recreated dogs by just sort of that selective breeding of let's just pick the tame ones, have them propagate. And what they found was that they got back to dogs because they were selecting the genes accidentally for tameness, but also were associated with these traits too. These genes go together as a unit. So back to plants. So what's going on here is that over time, organisms, be it animals or plants, their DNA changes. You'll pick up a change here or there, naturally occurring mutations in the DNA. No DNA ever stays static forever. Changes happen. And so when there's a change and you get an organism that has a trait you like, maybe it tastes better, maybe it produces a lot of fruit, maybe it's a bigger fruit. You're like, yes, I would like to have that trait in my future generations. You pick those individuals and you continue to breed them together until you're sort of getting that trait you like. And so as a corn geneticist, as a maize geneticist, I have to tell you the example of corn. So modern maize, corn, ZMAs, is sort of a structure we're all really familiar with. The tall stalk, it's got the tassel at the top, and then it produces the ears of corn off of that central stalk. So maize, corn, comes from an ancestral plant called Thyself. Thyself looks dramatically different than modern corn, modern maize. It's far more bush-like, and they're much thinner in terms of these stalks. Still has a little tassel on the top, but they're a little different. And it makes very, very different seed pods. So we have our modern corn here that has these very fleshy outer seeds that we can eat. Thyself actually has a hard shell coating around its seed pod. So it's really hard to eat Thyself. You actually have to crack it open, and then you can kind of eat out the flesh on the inside. So there are only, scientists have now figured out, 3 genes. So most plants have somewhere around 20 to 30,000 genes. There are only 3 genes in Thyself that changed, that caused the plant to go from this shape to this shape, and this cob to this cob. And so what scientists think happened is that there were some naturally occurring mutants, changes in Thyself, that made it easier for people to eat or harvest. In this picture here, you can see the fleshy part is actually kind of starting to poke out of the Thyself. And so it's easier to crack that open and eat it. And then at some point, there was a change, one of those mutations that fully removed or actually inverted the hard shell. So you could just directly like eat that seed. As well as making it go from a multi-stalk plant to a single stalk, and then making dramatically bigger ears, higher yield. So modern maize, only 3 genes changed, and we went from this to this, from this to this. So really a genetic modification. So plants have had this long history of domestication, much like dogs and other animals. So I've told you the example of Thyself to maize, and that's the sort of dramatic change you see here. But almost all of our modern food crops have come through that process of domestication, of picking naturally occurring genetic mutations, finding them to be beneficial to us, and then making sure just those ones survive and pass on their traits. And so you can see the difference between like the original wild tomato that was very, very small to modern domesticated cultivated tomato. Same thing for wheat. Wild wheat only has just a few little seed pods on it, whereas domesticated is much higher yielding. And grapefruit is a really interesting example. Grapefruit, all of these other ones fit in this category of naturally occurring changes We found a maize plant that had more kernels on it, bigger ears, and we said, yes, let's keep breeding that one. Grapefruit is a more modern one. It's one where farmers were growing grapefruit, but they were very small. The flesh was not as vivid pink, wasn't as tasty as it is today. And so they thought, well, this worked really well throughout history of let's look for a mutant, let's look for something different and breed it together. By this point in time, people started understanding DNA and mutations, and they thought, what if I could make mutations? What if I could speed up the rate of mutations? And then I might find something useful. So actually the way that grapefruits came around, or to our modern ruby reds that we're used to, is that farmers actually took this chemical mutagen that causes mutations in DNA, highly toxic because it will damage and mutate our DNA too, and they sprayed it on their field. And then what they saw was all of these different changes in grapefruit. And one of them happened to have this big, large, fleshy fruit, because mutation just randomly happened in some genes that caused this result. So I'm not sure if that was a really good idea. We don't do that anymore. We don't mass put out mutagens on fields. That's really dangerous. But that is actually how grapefruit came about. Doesn't mean grapefruit today is dangerous in any way. It's just that chemical caused changes in DNA that we now continue to propagate that fruit, and we use that fruit. So when people are picking those traits they like from certain plant varieties and breeding them together, what they're really doing is this process of artificial pollination. They're able to take pollen from one plant and put it onto the female part of the other plant so they can control which plants are breeding together. And so there's evidence of that very far back in history. Back 807 BC, there's these images of people doing controlled pollinations of dates and date palms. And I do this in my own research. This is how I do my genetic experiments, is that I collect the pollen out of one corn plant, and then I shake it onto the ear of another corn plant so I can control who is the father, who is the mother, what genes, what traits are coming together, and then being passed on to the offspring. So this is how we've sort of arrived at many of our modern food plants. These naturally occurring changes in DNA that give us some trait that we like. And so then we select these plants and we artificially pollinate, we artificially breed them together so that we know what traits will be in the offspring. So that was an example like of maize. Or we have the example of grapefruit, where we wanted to speed up that process. Rather than waiting for a mutation to occur, let's put something on there that will for sure cause mutations. And then we will look and, ooh, if we find a mutation that causes something we like, these bigger, fleshier pink grapefruit, we will continue to use and work with that plant. So, interesting little side note here. The FDA does not consider grapefruit a genetic modification. It's not considered a GMO. Why? Well, for one, it happened a very long time ago. It was more like in the 50s, before a lot of this labeling and acknowledgement of GMOs was happening, but also because it doesn't consider that direct. It's not a direct manipulation, and that the scientists went in there and changed the DNA. It's just, well, it was exposed to a lot of chemicals, a lot of things that were mutating DNA. We did not direct the change. So therefore, it's not considered a GMO. I'll leave that up to you guys to think about and debate whether you would consider that a GMO or not. So what does the FDA and USDA consider direct manipulation? So what sort of meets the criteria of a GMO today? So all of those things that I've been telling you about, that breeding of traits, not considered a GMO. That adding chemicals to create mutations, not considered a GMO. So a GMO by USDA and FDA standards is something where you take a piece of DNA. You take a gene from one organism. So like in our example of the gene from carrots that codes for beta carotene, you take that gene and now you're going to put it in another organism. We call this thing, this gene that we're going to move, we call it the transgene. Trans because it's moving from one species to the other, so our transgene. And then we have to take it out of carrots, for example, and now we need to go put it in another organism. So that process of putting it in another organism is called transformation. We need to get that DNA into that other organism. So in the case here of golden rice, we're now getting that beta carotene gene into rice. So that at the end, we end up with a transgenic organism, like our golden rice, our rice that now contains this new gene in it. You will often hear the terms transgenic organism interchanged with genetically modified organism, GMO. That's the one we tend to hear more in popular media, GMO, but it's also considered transgenic. It contains DNA, a transgene from another organism. So this is what when people say genetically modified organism, it's usually something that's gone through this process of directly taking out DNA, moving it into another organism, and now we've got this transgenic. So the history of genetically modified organisms, like I said earlier, really it started a very long time ago. If we want to consider people selecting genes, deciding who gets to breed with what, resulting in that domestication of animals and plants. So really it happened tens of thousands of years ago. But if you want to talk about what we now consider GMO, that direct modification of moving a gene from one organism to another, that really started to happen in like the 1980s, 1990s, when those abilities, those technologies to get a gene and move it started to occur. So in the 1990s, the first GMOs started to enter the marketplace. We worked out this process in the 80s of moving genes around. And so now they're ready, tested for safety, gone through the FDA, and now released as various different agricultural products. So the process of safety and regulation around GMOs is actually very intense. So the time from development of a gene to entering the marketplace is usually somewhere between around 15 years, sometimes even more like 20. So there's extensive 2 decades of testing of what is that transgene? What plant did it go into? Is this safe? Is there any concern associated with it? So I think one of the fears about GMOs is that scientists are doing crazy things and then they're just released into the environment or just in the grocery store for us to eat. But there is extensive health and safety testing that goes on before they are commercially available. So over really the last couple of decades, a variety of different crops have now been genetically modified. They have a gene in them that confers some traits, some benefits. So this is not a fully extensive list. It's actually 11 different crops that are commercially available GMOs today. So everything from corn to papaya. I'm going to tell you a little bit more about those two. And then actually there's pineapple I'm going to tell you about too. So 11 different commercially available crops on the market today. So I want to highlight a few to kind of tell you a little bit more about. So when we talk about genetic modification, the gene that goes in and then what's the trait that it makes, it can serve a lot of different purposes. It doesn't have to just be one type of thing. So I've actually broken these into 3 different categories that I want to tell you about. The first category is disease resistance. A lot of times GMOs are created because the crop or plant that we're working with is experiencing some sort of severe disease and they're being destroyed. And so we need to make them resistant. So one that's near and dear to my heart, BT corn. So BT corn was one of the first genetically modified crops on the market, back to that timeline. It's mid-90s, or when GMO corn really came on the market, although they were one of the first ones that we were sort of working with to understand. So BT corn, what it is there is a gene that's inside of a certain type of bacteria. This bacteria can make a compound that is toxic to corn borer. So corn borer is this insect here that just destroys fields. Once it gets in there, it just eats through the ear, really impacts farmers' yields. So this bacteria makes a compound that if the corn borer eats it, it's toxic to the corn borer, toxic to insects. It is not toxic to us. Humans, other animals have no impact if they eat this. But this is where I think a lot of the fears of GMOs started, is because this was one of the first GMOs that came on the market. And so you can imagine people are hearing, GMO, well, what is it? Well, it's making a toxin. It's making something that's toxic to corn borer. And so I think that's where a lot of the initial fear came from, was, well, yeah, you got corn, it's producing a toxin, and now I eat it, am I in danger? Is there any risk there? So I think that's a really valid reason for why people started to have some concern and worry about it. But I think it is important to say that this is not something that's toxic to humans, it's not toxic to animals, it's just targeted to these particular types of insects. But it's understandable where that sort of connection came from in people's minds. Another example are papayas. So did you guys know every single papaya that you find at the grocery store is GMO? There is not any non-genetically modified papaya left. Very few of them left up there. So what happened was in the 1960s, and then it really ramped up quite bad for the next 3 decades into the 1990s, there was a virus called the ring spot virus that started spreading throughout all papaya fields. It resulted in the plants dying and the fruits becoming inedible. And so they had to do something about this if they wanted to save papayas. So there's actually a scientist from Cornell who discovered if you took, much like a vaccine, so if you guys have gotten your COVID-19 vaccine or any other vaccine, what it is simply a little bit of information from the virus inside of that shot that you get, so that you have now a little piece of that virus, not the full virus, but just one of those proteins, one of those viral proteins inside of you. And it helps your body train to be aware of the virus and then fight it off. They did the same thing with papaya. They actually took one of the genes from the virus, so it would make a viral protein inside of papaya, and it essentially vaccinated papayas, so they would now recognize and be able to fight off this ring spot virus. So really the only papayas that survived to this day are ones that have this genetic modification in them. They have a gene in them from the original virus, so that they are essentially vaccinated against it. So that's one broad category of GMOs, is sort of putting in a gene into a crop or a plant that will make it resistant, it will protect it from some sort of disease. And there are other examples too, these are just 2. Oh, one that is not genetically modified. Yes, question?
Do the papaya pass on the vaccination to the next generation?
They do.
So it's not like a vaccine.
Correct. And that's one of the big differences, is that we don't yet want to genetically modify people. Plants, if we mess it up, it's not going to be dangerous for us to eat, but it could make the plant less productive. And so we just don't want to take that risk yet with people. So we want to make sure we have that process really well understood. So when you get a vaccine, it's just temporary. It's just putting the protein in, or putting something called RNA that will help make the protein, but it's not DNA. So there's no genetic modification that happens in vaccines. There's no permanent change. Whereas with plants, this is a permanent vaccination. This is something that will pass on then to future offspring, because it is a change in the DNA. Yep.
Is that also about microchips?
Yes, it does. So RNA, fun fact, which is in your COVID-19 vaccine, if you just leave it out, it breaks down in 2 minutes. That's how temporary RNA is. So no microchips. Break down very quickly. So bananas are actually one that was not on that list of genetically modified crops. We do not have genetically modified bananas. Bananas are in serious trouble. There is a disease called Panama disease. It's a fusarium wilt. It's a type of fungus that infects bananas. And currently there is serious impact on the world production of Cavendish bananas, the main bananas that you go to the grocery store and buy and eat. It's also impacting plantains, which are a major source of food in parts of the world. And so the fusarium, the fungus, has continued to change over time. So we had types of bananas, cultivars, that were resistant. And so we just started breeding and growing more of those. But now the fungus has evolved to a point where it's able to infect all bananas. There are no bananas, no cultivars that are resistant left. So bananas are not one that we are able to genetically modify at this point. And there's a big push right now to try to create genetically modified bananas, because we don't have a way to combat this. It's just involving a lot of pesticide spray right now. They're just blanketing banana plantations with pesticide. They are, with this antifungal compound, they are having to burn entire banana plantations that have any of this sort of disease. And it's actually so highly contagious that if a worker at one field hits the dirt on their shoe and then walk over to another field, it will transfer through the soil on the bottom of the shoes. So it's an area of big concern, and we don't have a way to combat this at the moment. So another category of making genetic modifications is really for nutrition or taste. And so this was a GMO that came out in the early to mid 90s. It's called Flavor Saver. And so Flavor Saver was a modification that they made in tomatoes. And so this one never really caught on. It's actually not that widespread. But what it was rather than putting a gene into tomatoes, what they did is there's a gene in tomatoes that makes tomatoes go like this. It makes them break down. Obviously, everything is going to break down eventually and spoil, but it sort of rapidly caused rapid degradation, rapid breakdown of the tomato. So they went in and they turned off that gene. They essentially broke it so that now the tomato would not rot as fast. And so it was supposed to prevent spoilage and help for like shipping and less food waste. Again, it didn't work that great. It actually was not, it still degraded, tomatoes still mushed. But they did try for a while, but you probably haven't seen this one in the stores. Another one that I've already mentioned a couple of times is this golden rice. This effort to combat malnutrition around the world, where there are communities and populations that are severely malnourished. They may have access to food, but maybe not nutrient dense or nutrient rich food. And so there was a nonprofit group made up of individuals from over 15 different universities that were working on this effort to make golden rice. Let's find various different genes that will produce important vitamins and nutrients, and can we put that into a food crop that's already growing in that area? So that individuals who are already growing rice and eating rice, but now can have sort of nutrient-enriched rice, like beta-carotene, which helps with vitamin A. So unfortunately, golden rice does not have a very happy ending at this point, because one of the things that scientists didn't think about was that how would these communities feel about eating golden rice? And so rice has really strong importance in a variety of different cultures, and its color and its texture is meaningful. And so when they brought out golden rice, it was actually rejected by many different groups. It's just not what they are used to eating. It's not the color they're expecting, and so they are unwilling to eat it. So it's something where I think it's really important to consider the sociology and the acceptance of these sorts of things before we try to make it. Is this something that people will actually use? And the last one in this taste and nutrition category is something called pink glow. So this one is supposed to hit the markets in the late 2020s. So it is approved. It's currently being grown in Costa Rica. And what this is a pineapple that, much like Flavor Saver over here, rather than having a gene put into it, this is another instance of where a gene is turned off or broken. So there is a gene inside of pineapples that takes lycopene, which is the thing that makes tomatoes red. It's a pigment. And it gets converted actually into beta-carotene, the thing that makes orange or yellow. So it's changing stuff from red to yellow. And if you can break that change from red to yellow, you'll just stay red. It actually kind of ends up looking pink. So pineapples are always naturally pink. They just turn to yellow by the point at which we pick them and eat them. And so what this is just keep them pink, essentially. And it actually leads to a sweeter taste as well. And so this one has been approved by the FDA in 2016, and they're now starting to start growing these at various different locations around the world to bring it to market. Like I said, probably in the next, they say about 3 years to see this at the grocery store. So the last one that I want to tell you about, the last category is environment. Yeah, Lisa.
Back to the, why do they want to turn off?
Honestly, just for sales and new products. So it's actually Del Monte who owns this one and who has patented it. And it's simply just to have another product that people might like to eat. Kind of these pineapple sales. Some of the complaints about pineapple, right, is that it's too tart, too sour. So this actually has a much sweeter taste. So it's I think Del Monte is hoping people will buy a lot of this pineapple. So not necessarily increased nutritional value, just preference and taste. Yeah, but I think it is interesting. It's Del Monte who has patented this one, so that's who will be producing it. So the last category is the environment. We know that realities of the environment are changing very rapidly. And so how can we change plants to deal with that and to help us with those issues? So one that I mentioned earlier at the beginning of the presentation is this thing called Arboretum. So what Arboretum is a company that are making these eucalyptus trees. Eucalyptus trees grow really quickly. So they're actually really good at combating CO2 pollution. They can suck up a lot of CO2 from the air and then sequester it within their own biomass. But the problem is that eucalyptus trees only grow in certain regions that are warmer. So they've actually introduced some genes into eucalyptus that make them resistant to cold, so that we can start growing these eucalyptus trees more in North America and other parts of the world to help combat CO2 emissions and pollution. So they're actually growing these right now in Kentucky, seeing essentially how far north can they handle. Snorkel rice. I told you I was going to show you some more pictures of this one. So this one is fascinating. This one I find just incredible. So this was the example of, we have our type of rice that farmers grow that's very high yielding, produces a large quantity, taste that people prefer. But given climate patterns, flooding is far more likely now in some areas, and so farmers will lose their entire crop if a flood comes, covers their fields for an extended amount of time, and then the rice dies because it cannot gas exchange. So this is a variety of rice that can handle floods. And so what happens is when the rice plant is covered entirely with water, it stimulates itself to grow a little more. And then if it gets covered with water, it grows a little more. And it just keeps growing higher and higher. And specifically, one of the things you can't see well in there that it's growing is a thin little tube that looks like a snorkel. And so this is where it's able to take in CO2 that it needs and then emit back out the oxygen that it produces through photosynthesis. So it's able to do that gas exchange, carbon dioxide and oxygen, and survive. So this is actually a picture of how tall one of these varieties of snorkel rice was able to grow in response to flooding. Yeah, and so it's actually just two genes inside of this variety of rice that if you take them out and put them into the type of rice that we grow for agricultural purposes, you can now have agricultural rice growing these tall tubes and surviving floods. So what I want to leave you guys with is actually some questions for you guys. So we talked through sort of the traditional domestication of plants, this breeding of this individual with that individual to get some desired traits. I told you about the example of grapefruit, where we applied a chemical to cause mutations, not directly and intentionally, but out of it, we did then get this fruit. Or direct modification of the DNA, going in and making changes. So that traditional breeding, that domestication of plants, you guys think that's a GMO? Would you guys consider that a genetic modification? Getting a lot of no's, thumbs down. Okay, you agree with USDA and FDA then, yeah? What about that mutagenesis one? Would you consider that a genetic modification? Get some no's and some yeses. Some no's and yes. Mixed house. So, yep, like I said, FDA does not consider that a GMO, but me as a geneticist, I might say, like, yeah, you caused a bunch of genetic changes. Kind of sounds like it's me, but it's not considered a GMO. And then this last one of doing that genetic engineering or that genetic editing, going in there and making a certain change. Do you consider that a GMO? So you guys are saying yes? What about that case of the snorkel rice? What if it's something where you took a gene out of one type of rice and you put it into another type of rice? You could do that by breeding. You could achieve that thing. You could take the snorkel rice and you could breed it with the agricultural rice and you could get there eventually. You consider within a species, consider that a GMO. Isn't that traditional breeding? So you could get there by traditional breeding, but they're doing it faster, right? They're taking the gene out of the snorkel rice and they're putting it into the agricultural rice.
If you separate the outcome from the process, then the process of simply interbreeding seems not to be GM. But if you're actually directly taking the gene, that is.
So people have been struggling with this. USDA and FDA, is this genetic engineering? Is this a GMO? So up to this point, they've been saying, yes, it is. Because the process by which we take the gene out and put it into the other organism, even if it's all within corn, or even if it's all within rice, right? It's same species moving the genes around. They are still calling that genetic modification. Oh, before I get to my last point, do you think we should label it as a GMO?
Yes, because some people have concerns, so.
So better to inform, let people know. So, oops. So the last thing I want to leave you with and tell you, and I won't get into the like gory details unless later if you want to talk about it. We now have this new way of doing genetic engineering, of doing genetic editing. You may have heard the term, has anyone heard the term CRISPR? Yeah, so have you guys heard that term? So what CRISPR is it's a new way of doing that, take the gene out of one species and put it into another, such that we sort of consider it scarless. It's something where the current processes, the ones from the 1980s that have been used to essentially make all of our GMOs to this point, we take the gene out, put it into the other species, but we can't quite control where it goes. So we put it in, but it could go anywhere in the genetic material of that plant. So I would agree that, yeah, that should be a GMO because that is not something that you could achieve through breeding. But now what we're saying is you could take a gene from your snorkel rice, put it into your agricultural rice, and you could put it in a way that is exactly mimicking breeding, in a way where you can control it, nothing else changes, you can guarantee there are no off-target effects, no mistakes, no other changes that have led to some of these concerns about allergies or other fears that sometimes people have for GMOs of you don't really know what you did. Now we know. We have such a controlled way of editing that we can guarantee to you this, the exact same thing as if you bred them together. So this is where the FDA is at in terms of if people use CRISPR, which won the Nobel Prize in 2020 because it's so controlled, it's so precise, that I can essentially recreate breeding for you in one generation. In one generation, I can take these two plants and now get you this optimal combination of traits and genes. And I can tell you exactly what I did and that there's no risk. So we aren't sure. We aren't sure if that should be considered a GMO or not. As much like Ernest said, the process is different, but the final product is exactly the same. So if the final product is the exact same as what you would have gotten through normal breeding, I don't know. So the USDA is thinking about giving it a new term, calling it something besides GMO. Again, maybe still label it, but make it clear that it's a little different.
When you do that with CRISPR, can you tell that it's been done, or is it totally?
In theory, no, you could not tell the difference. So then that's very hard to regulate too.
I'm surprised it can be so specific, given the 48 chromosomes in humans or same number in, well, not the same number, but a similar large number in plants. How could you always be sure that it was exactly in that one spot?
Yeah, and that's something where once you do it, you can take the DNA out, you can take the whole genome, as we call it, and sequence it and guarantee that it is there, and only allow the ones that are for sure exactly what you want to allow to move into the market. And anything else you would not allow into the market. So we have this ability now to sequence all DNA inside of a plant and know for sure, whereas we didn't have that back in the 80s.
Well, I think that might be a general concern that given the breadth and diversity of nature generally, you wouldn't always be able to control for exactly the right placement in the right spot all the time.
Right.
With a plant, you can always see if it breeds properly and test it and then discard the ones that are not right, but for other things, it would be
Yeah, and CRISPR, part of the reason why it won the Nobel Prize is that it is so exact. Certainly you should always screen it and test and be sure, but it is showing to be incredibly accurate. And that's why we're starting to consider to use this in people. Because we are not reaching that threshold of confidence that it is exactly what we intend it to be, so that maybe now it's safe to use as a medicine, as a therapy, not just something to change plants. So, with that, I hope that maybe now if you hear the term GMO, in the future, some other things might come to mind besides maybe just toxic. But all of these other ways, all of these other, even animals, but all these ways that GMOs exist inside of our food system, or perhaps to address climate and environmental concerns. And so with that, I just want to see if you guys have any questions. Oh, and this is my group, and I had them out in the field this summer when we were growing a lot of corn. So.
In the late 80s or early 90s, I heard a very interesting talk by a researcher on introducing vaccine genes
Yes.
into bananas, because in the underdeveloped world, it's very difficult to maintain the cold chain for most of our vaccine.
Yep.
And specifically targeting diseases that are transmitted orally, like polio and hypo. And have you heard anything? Is there still ongoing work in that field?
Yeah, I didn't include that example. So the question was, back in the 80s and 90s, there was this idea that could we use food as a source of vaccination? So that idea of getting that sort of viral protein into people, you can inject it into people, or you could put it into their food so that they eat it, right? And that becomes a lower barrier for countries that have socioeconomic realities that make vaccination really difficult. How do you get vaccines sort of widespread into a more rural or less resourced community? And so the idea was, could we essentially put polio vaccine type thing into food, into bananas, into some crop that individuals were eating? It was an idea back then. They started working on it, and then when sort of the anti-GMO push came around, a lot of that slowed down, because again, back to that idea of, is it safe? What exactly are you doing? Is it right to put that into somebody's food supply and give it to them without them knowing, or even if they did know, would they consume it? Much like the golden rice, where people wouldn't eat it. So there were some concerns along the lines of acceptance. However, the science is still there, and they are still working on it. And so yes, the idea to try to, go eat a banana rather than getting a shot, like great, I'll do that, right? I'm gonna get my vaccine in the morning when I eat a banana. So I think with the appreciation that pandemics are happening, right? And what is the risk of not being vaccinated? I think that is sort of reintroducing this idea of maybe we could use foods as a way to vaccinate individuals. So yeah, the science is still ongoing, but there isn't one that's out there yet.
The other thing that makes bananas particularly attractive is they're grown in a lot of the areas of the underdeveloped world.
Right.
And they're something that little children will eat.
Right.
That's the target population you're looking for. So if you could develop it, make it very, very feasible.
Yeah, and now there's a double push now to be able to do that because of the fusarium results. So the hurdle is, bananas are actually really difficult to genetically modify. Each plant has its own realities. So you can't, just because you can genetically modify cotton, corn doesn't mean you can automatically use those exact same methods in banana. Similar, but each plant's different. And so they're still working on those hurdles in banana, and now there's extra motivation given Panama disease. So yeah, it is still very much an active area of scientific development.
Early on, you asking how people respond to GMOs.
Yeah.
And certainly some of the response has to do with non-target effects,
Right.
side effects. And thinking particularly of Roundup Ready corn, what corn does to monarchs, et cetera, is a broad concern.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think another reason there's been this sort of anti-GMO sentiment is that a lot of GMOs were based in put in a gene to make you resistant to a herbicide like Roundup. So if you're Roundup Ready soybeans or corn that are resistant to this herbicide, now you can mass spray that herbicide across the field, kill any other plant that's trying to grow in your field, and only your corn or your soybean comes up. And so then I think that's another way where GMO got linked to chemicals and mass application of chemicals. And my wish as a scientist and someone who does genetic modification is that that wouldn't have been the first push of GMOs. If it hadn't have been ET corn, and if it hadn't have been Roundup Ready crops, and instead we had started with a crop that had nutritional value, or started with a genetic modification that did something beneficial for a developing country. Maybe then the public mindset about GMOs would have been different, and it wouldn't have had this association with toxin and herbicides, pesticides, because you're right. A lot of the early GMOs were tied to things that could be very negative to the environment in terms of increased spraying. But that doesn't mean all GMOs are that. And so that's sort of my wish. And I think that's why sometimes scientists are starting to think through, could we call that CRISPR change something else? And then use it just sort of in these nutritional realms, or use it in these areas that wouldn't involve Roundup spray, so that it has this different mentality around it.
That was one thought I was having. Basically, you said there are two categories, GMO, non-GMO. But actually, there may be
Maybe a third. Yeah, and the point about organic and GMO, they're actually very separate things, but they've gotten conflated in our general lexicon. Organic is a way of growing plants, right? Organic is, are you applying chemicals? Are you, what are your methods for growing that plant? Whereas GMO is, what are in the genetics of the plant? But because the two got conflated very early on, genetically modified organisms are now under that umbrella of like not being considered organic. When as scientists, those are really separate things. There is what's in the genes of the plant and what's the method, right? So mass spraying of Roundup is very non-organic, right? So you can do that anywhere, regardless of the plant and its genetics. So perhaps a third category is needed.
So we're told for nutritionalists, don't rely on vitamins. You can't just dose yourself with vitamins because it's an absorption issue. Right. And there's a further complication with the biome. It's a great source of interest and mostly ignorance still at this point.
Yeah.
So reflecting back on GMOs aren't we still in a big sphere of ignorance in terms of what the body will accept and prosper with? So if you're making one change has still undetermined effects on the other, because as they say, there are so many other chemicals in a vegetable that help us absorb or make good use of nutritional.
Yeah, and I think that's why you see a lot of the nutritional push ones to be within like very similar family types of plants. The golden rice, or even the pineapple, which is not necessarily nutritionally based, but plants that are perhaps already doing something or making a compound and maybe just increasing it, right? So could we make a genetically modified carrot that just increases the amount of beta carotene? So taking things not completely out of their context, I think is going to be important for that absorption and that uptake question. Things where the plant is also providing these other components needed to help that absorption. I think that is really important. But yeah, I think personally, one of the modifications I didn't have a chance to tell you about, but things like this I think will be really important in terms of like environmental realities. So there's two different ways for plants to do photosynthesis, called C3 and C4. Still all photosynthesis, but one of them is more efficient with water. If a plant has this one version of photosynthesis, it needs much less water. And so that's an area where I think genetic modification could really help. There's a big effort to change a lot of plants that are doing this more inefficient photosynthesis into the more efficient version. Because water and drought and water supply is going to be a major issue going forward. So I think things where plant can already do it or very close, and we're just asking it to do a little more or increase its efficiency, deal with the changing environment, might be where the next best benefit is.
I have a question back on corn.
Yeah.
How much of that selective breeding did Native Americans do when they came over that 20,000 years or so?
Yeah, that's a great question. So Thyself is found in Central America. Yeah, mostly in Central America, some Northern South American countries. And so that's where like the evolution of Thyself into maize occurred. But then you're right, indigenous populations then brought maize northward. And now we have over 2,000 different, we call them land races, varieties of maize, where locally adapted to each region. So up here we have things that are much more cold tolerant, flake corn, that can handle colder temperatures versus the more southern parts of our country, all the way down to Central America, where the varieties are different. So there was local selective breeding happening to make a type of maize that's best suited for, you know, southwestern US versus northeastern US. Yeah, there's over 2,000 different like native and indigenous varieties of maize. Incredible.
So we're not losing, I mean, in the effort to, I don't know, maybe more modern, to make more, use breeding characteristics of shipping or attractiveness in the grocery store. But we're not losing the original genetic basis, like those earlier varieties or even ancient varieties. Is there effort to actually have a storage or maintain the original genetic materials so we don't lose even more that we don't eat anymore?
Right, yes. And I think that's one of the new shifts when it comes to genetic modification. I think the early GMOs were, what can we take and put into the plant so that we can spray Roundup, right? These very cross species, very like far-reaching modifications from a bacteria into corn, right? And so I think now most of the focus on GMOs is, can we maintain those heritage and heirloom varieties that are going to be a great source of traits? In there could be better tasting food. There could be different types of cultivars that are resistant to something that's now becoming a major source. But I want to absolutely maintain all of those heirloom varieties as that source of genetic diversity, all of those different genes that could really help out our modern agricultural varieties. But then can I use CRISPR to get that gene out of that, you know, variety of maize that's grown in that part of the world, but actually it's resistant to some disease, and put it now into our agricultural corn in one generation, rather than trying to like breed it together and breed and breed and breed, which takes about 10 years to do. We call it intergressing a trait. So getting a trait from one variety into the other variety, but just that one desired like disease resistant trait, because I want to keep all my other high yielding other desired traits. It takes about 10 years. So could CRISPR be that way to get that desired gene into our agricultural line? But I have to maintain that heirloom diversity of types to be my source material. So yeah, I think there is a big push now to make sure we're maintaining all of that variety, because it's going to be the source of problem solving in the future.
Yeah, broader resistant bacteria, fungus, and insects mutate more rapidly, maybe, but maybe not anymore. But you always got to be in the cycle of staying ahead of the human diseases and vaccines.
Right.
So.
Monoculture is a big issue, yep, because as soon as something is able to now attack that variety, it just runs random through the population. So yeah, thinking about maybe is there ways that we could, they're all high yielding varieties, but they're genetically very different to try to cut down on that disease spread and evolution. Yeah, Lisa.
Who has control of the old seed bank, and why, how often are scientists allowed to request a seed, or they are saved, or why aren't they using one of the original banana seeds after they burn down a field? Bring out a seed and try to start it. Is there? That's probably what I'm not sure. All those questions.
Yeah, no, it's a great question. And so the banking of all of these different seed types that have these different varieties is a real active push. But then to get them all out and then screen them all for who has that variety is really difficult. So one of the areas of investigation is, can we sequence the genomes of all of those different variety types? Can we have the DNA on file so then maybe when we get really good at this, probably with the help of AI, we can just scan all of the genomes and be like, go take that seed out of storage and let's use that one rather than which one of these 2,000 do I start with? Because I got to plant all 2,000 and then screen them all to find out who's resistant. So yeah, that's one of the big genomic efforts that's ongoing. I can speak to the other part of your question about how accessible are they. So at least in the world of maize, there are these repositories in North America, in Mexico, Europe, a variety of different organizations who their goal is to hold all of these varieties, and then people can request them. However, as a heavy user of that, they are very limited on what they will give you. So they will give you 20 seeds, and you are now the keeper forever of those. So you better be a really good gardener or a really good farmer, because once you run through your 20 seeds, they're not going to send you anymore, because they really have to be careful with their stores. And I've been in the boat of like, you requested those seeds 5 years ago. We're not sending you anymore. Darn it, so it is something where they will share seed, and freely. There's usually no charge for that, but they're highly restrictive about how many seeds they will send, and then they'll never send you anymore, just because they have to maintain their collections.
Where is it? Where's the?
So it's the Germplasm Resource GRIN, GRIN. Germplasm Resource, I forget the I and the N. USDA hosted. So it's a big repository of a variety of different seeds. USDA runs it, maintains it. There's a similar sister program in Mexico, specifically for maize and some other crops as well too.
That's worldwide.
Yep, worldwide access. Yep, anyone in the world can write and ask for, I saw that variety of maize, could I have some of that seed? And
They produce their own seeds or other people?
That's a great question. You can deposit your seeds there, but they are very particular about it because of issues of disease and whatnot. So usually there's a long process if you want to get your seeds on file there. You can ultimately do that, but they want to make sure that it comes to them, they plant it, grow it, then harvest their own seeds off of your original. They won't just put your original straight into collection. And yeah, it's a major resource that like people in my field use to get access to these different genetic varieties. Yep. And they're not the only ones. There are like smaller private organizations. There's one that does specifically Southwestern US maize varieties, and you can just go there. And again, they restrict how many you can buy. They're a little more, they'll give you more like 100 seeds. But so it's not just the USDA, there are also private foundations as well that maintain seed stocks.
So would they take a seed, try to regrow the banana, it's doing all the expensive research, or do they just feel like we want to keep improving, so we're going to keep doing research, but maybe we'll do some seeds from past as well, so that we don't so hard to.
Yeah, I think a lot of times individuals, they'll start with what's currently growing around the world already, so what's sort of out and being used, and they'll use currently growing cultivars to see if any of them are resistant, and if none of them are resistant, like in the case of the banana, then we have to start going back to seeds and growing them. But it's a bit difficult of which one do we start with, and how many, and it takes a long time to grow a whole banana tree. So that's where I think genomics, like sequencing the DNA and knowing what am I looking for? What would a gene look like that could confer resistance? That's where I think the future is at. So then you know which seed to start growing and working with. I know, it's a really scary problem. I need my bananas. Oh, I'm sorry,
Good
yes.
question from Zoom
Yeah.
about what resources you would recommend for further learning on GMOs or CRISPR for us to look into.
Oh, that is an excellent question, because yes, GMO misinformation is it's a big concern. So I think the USDA is a great place to look for accurate information on this. I work with both transgenic corn, genetically modified corn, and non-genetically modified corn. And I have to apply to the USDA every time I want to take my seed that is GMO and move it across state lines. Because they're so concerned about, to whoever had the point earlier, about spread in the environment. So they want to know what is in each state, what might be planted. You cannot plant genetically modified seed outside without a permit. So I work with genetically modified corn, but I do not grow it outside because I'm not allowed to. I have genetic modifications in there that we don't want going around and like interbreeding with the corn and sweet corn we're gonna harvest and eat. So I think that's one of the other myths about GMOs is that it's really unregulated, but it's actually really highly regulated. And USDA is home to all of that. There's some other good GMO literacy groups. But I could get those names and maybe we could send something out. Yeah, I can track down a couple of places I like to use. But yeah, the usage of GMOs out in a field is highly regulated, because there are concerns about what did you modify and is it spreading its pollen around and wanting to contain that spread. So I have a field where we grow corn, but the only corn that we grow out there is non-GMO. Interestingly, sorry, corn side tangent. There are things in corn that act weird genetically. They can make all kinds of changes that you wouldn't expect and predict, but they're naturally occurring. They naturally evolved in corn to do things like make this corn more purple rather than yellow. It's not considered a GMO because the corn evolved it itself. So that's what I've got growing out of my field. And then I grow all of my genetically modified corn in a specialized growth chamber up in our greenhouse where I can't cross contaminate. So.
It's based on trust.
So when I came here, I had to apply for 200 permits because of 200 types of corn. And then Hamilton checks that I have all of my permits, and then at any time I can be surprise audited. USDA, depending on your size and what your permits say, they can come by your site and visit at any time. And when I was at University of Georgia for my postdoc, they would come by because we had a larger operation running there. Many more plants growing in our greenhouse, also get larger fields going, they would come. So, yep, it is a bit of a trust in that at any given moment, somebody needs to be honest about what they're planting in the ground outside, but there are permits and there are audits and there's.
Somebody areas could be on the side. So,
Yep, it's possible. But the only way to make genetically modified most plants is if you have this really deep skill set. And USDA knows who those people are, and then you also have to apply to permits every time you want to make them. So there's only certain centers in the US, Cornell, Iowa State, a few others, where they have the technology to do this. So when I want to make it, I have to partner with them. And they tell USDA, Natalie Nannas is making this thing, put her on file. So it's documented who and what, and you have to ask, say, I want to make this thing. Because yeah, they will get into fine detail down to what exactly are you doing, what is your sequence, you have to send me all of your data. It is highly regulated. And so it's not something where you can willy-nilly just like take some DNA and shove it into a plant. It takes about a year to make one, and each step is permitted and regulated. Yeah, but then at that point, yes, there is trust in the scientists. Yeah.
I was surprised to learn number one most popular fruit in the world are mangoes. And the longest time here, that was a very forgettable fruit because they were developed for transportation issues was the biggest focus of the fruit, and they were so interesting. And I guess you were discussing longevity, but really isn't transportation, hasn't that been the main focus of GMO efforts and related? So longevity is related to transportation, but it also includes durability and, you know, ruggedness, and shipping and so forth. Hasn't that really been the focus of GMO?
Certainly that was the focus of that flavor saver. I think a lot of GMO effort has really been in yield and resistance to disease. But I think that process and durability are definitely areas that I'm sure are being investigated and worked on.
Well, now Europeans would say our food tastes much better than the US. So what's going on there?
I think that's where the base variety that we're working with, right? We're working with a variety that's durable, right? We're working with a tomato type that tastes mealy and grainy and it's awful, but like it's really firm and it will survive shipping, right? Whereas if you have a point source, you know, food situation where you can grow that tastier variety that has so many more sugars in it, but it's fragile and it doesn't ship well. I think that's more of a, not the GMO, but the like base cultivar type we're working with, we have in our country used very
Could it simply be that Europeans are quite willing to shop daily or often every week, therefore catering to them? It's a different matter.
Exactly, which is why I think, you know, small scale farming and local farming, local food source is really important. And that's where I think a lot of the taste and variety is gonna come from. We have massive scale industrial complex. We're growing huge monoculture fields of things. For efficiency, for price, for transportation, it doesn't necessarily make it taste great. So is there some way where we can combine the realities of our agricultural system with maybe these varieties that actually taste better, so we can get a higher quality food? Yeah. Right.
Well done. Good
Thank
job.
you. Yeah.
At some point, not now, I need to tell you more about selection of food from connection to Hamilton scientists.
Oh, and Saunders, okay, yeah.
It's not just peas. There's a wheat.
I did not know that. I only knew about the peonies.
Another time.
Yeah.
There's more time.
Well, and thank you for your Veterans Day email that you always send every year, because it actually always reminds me to make sure I call my grandfather.
Oh, good.
So yeah, I thought I was like, I need to call my
Good.
grandfather.
Good.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. You know, big bang theory?
I know of it, but I actually haven't watched very. I haven't watched.
There's an episode there where Sheldon took a brain and then the outfit comes up with flowing fish. And I thought the other day, that's never gonna happen.
We're to the point now where it's not just